This conference will now be recorded.
My name is Siziwe Mwabe. I am the operations lead for Africa Evidence Network. I will be chairing the webinar today. This webinar is hosted by the AEN in partnership with eBASE Africa. And I would like to take this opportunity to welcome everyone who's attending today. This is our 12th webinar that we are hosting as the AEN, and the title of the webinar today is Getting Research into Households through eBASE Family-Centered Evidence Toolkit for Disability. As we draw closer to Evidence 2020 online, this webinar is one of the events hosted that are building up to this particular event. It is part of Workstream 2, Enhancing Capacities. Participants in this particular workstream have an incredible opportunity to imagine new agenda for capacity development for African EIDM. Taking this further, the models already used by sharing and discovering different ways of looking at how to develop capacity. So this is really one of the interesting work streams that we're building up to during the conference. Our speakers from eBASE Africa will share how they developed an approach that uses voice and preferences of people living with disabilities, community health workers, and policymakers to promote the use of evidence to improve livelihoods of people living with disabilities at home and in the community. This approach is built on synthesized evidence from global evidence community, and it focuses on health, education, social well-being, empowerment, and livelihood for people with disabilities. So this is really one of those interesting topics that will assist us as we go to Evidence 2020. That was just to give you a bit of background in terms of what this webinar is all about. Let's now go to housekeeping. We need to ensure that the webinar runs seamlessly, so we need to look at a few housekeeping rules or rules of engagement to ensure that all of us are able to participate and advance this discussion that's going to take place during this webinar. So we're just going to keep our technical processes very simple. There will be no webcams during this session. And then we're going to record this webinar, and later the recordings and the slides that are going to be used during the session will be shared with all the participants. We will mute the microphones of all the participants and unmute you when you are supposed to share your input or ask a question during a Q&A session. We have a chat box. Please, during the session, as the speakers are sharing their learning and lessons, please use the chat box to continue the conversations and also share your questions so that later the speakers can get the opportunity to answer all your questions. And if all the questions are not answered during this webinar, we'll make sure that we give you responses via email to ensure that you have an answer to the question that you've raised. Please also write in the chat or to raise up your hand if you need to give an input during the Q&A session. In case you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please write to precious@ace@uj.ac.za. So this will help us to be able to manage our webinar and make things easier so that we can be audible and hear each other. Just to share a little bit about Africa Evidence Network, the AEN is a Pan-African community of more than 3,000 individuals that are interested in the use of evidence in the continent. And also our vision is to contribute to the end of poverty and inequality. And we we're contributing also to the increasing and the use of evidence in decision-making in the continent. And we have 4 ways of working. We inform as the AEN. We use different modalities of engagement to inform. The newsletter is one of those. We connect with our members through Evidence 2020 is one of our events, and also this webinar is one of the ways to connect to our members across the continent and beyond. And also other ways we learn from the work that we do through landscape maps and other ways of learning. And also, most importantly, we advocate for the work that is done in the continent through our Africa Evidence Leadership Award and other modalities of engagement that we have. Please get in touch with us. These are our details, and they'll be shared at the end of the webinar as well. At this moment, I would like to hand over to Patrick from eBASE Africa, as he is the first speaker during the webinar. Over to you, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Siziwe. Today, I will be presenting with 3 of my colleagues on the topic of getting research into households, as has been introduced by Siziwe. So myself, Patrick Okwen, I'm a physician and also an evidence enthusiast, mostly for basic services and targeting children with disability. I'll also be talking with the who is the program manager for disability at eBASE Africa, and she's also passionate about getting using innovative approaches to promote livelihoods or to improve livelihoods for people with disability. Then we also have Alvin, who is an economist working with eBASE Africa. He's also still doing his master's program at the University of Yaounde 1, and he's very interested in improving financial security for people with disability. And finally, we would have Awea Kofu, who is a researcher with eBASE and is currently active on some work that's promoting educational attainment for underserved population in Middle Africa, a project that's funded by EEF UK and the CEDIL program. Slide, please. So today we would be looking at how we are learning from the experimenting society, and with a particular focus on how we are learning in disability in the experimenting society. Slide. So generally, learning is supposed to learning and experimenting are supposed to happen together, but unfortunately, this usually doesn't happen. And part of what we do is to ensure that there's the link between what the researchers are doing and the projects that are being implemented, and we are learning from the results of this experiment. Slide. So first, I will start by talking about the 4 waves of evidence revolution, and this concept is taken from a paper published by Howard White in Palgrave Communications, which talks about 4 different waves of the evidence revolution. In the 90s, there was a results agenda where we were all looking at Millennium Development Goals, and this changed onto the Sustainable Development Goals. And then in the years 2000, there became the rise of the impact evaluation. We wanted to be sure exactly how do interventions compare to others. And then also came the rise of the systematic reviews, where we were thinking about, okay, how do we put together all the evidence that's out there and critically appraise them? And then finally, the knowledge brokering era. And that is where the project that we'll be sharing with you today is actually helping to do. It's actually brokering knowledge from systematic reviews and impact evaluations and results outcome monitoring into households of people living with disability. Slide. So if we begin with looking at the results agenda, we all know about the Millennium Development Goals, Health for All by the year 2000, which moved on to the Sustainable Development Goal. Then the Sustainable Development Goals were also adapted for people with disability by the UN Convention for the Rights of People with Disability. And this is one of the documents that really informed the project that we implemented. And then we also have the Agenda 2060, the Africa Union for the Africa we want, which also worked a little bit more on outcomes, results measurement, and came up with certain aspirations that we are looking up to for Africa. Slide. Then we now look at the impact evaluation. So the impact evaluations, there's been a lot being done for randomized control trials, etc. However, including people with disability has always been a challenge. So in this project, we actually were informed from projects like the Pearl Project, which is partnerships for inclusive research and learning, and also the Disability Inclusive Development, which is an approach that's used by the UN and the others. And we also, I'm sure many of us will be aware of the Consort Equity. The Stroke Equity is also underway, but these are all areas in impact evaluations that was looking at bringing on board increasing inclusiveness in the impact evaluation era. Slide. Then finally, we look at, after all the randomized control trials are done, the big question is, what happens? How can we put together several studies? And this inspiration actually was dating back as from 1979, when Cochrane Archie said, it is surely a great criticism of our profession that we have not organized a critical summary by specialty and subspecialty adapted periodically of all relevant randomized control trials. So in the year 2000, this concept gained a lot of waves, and we are now looking beyond just randomized control trials. We're also looking at observational studies. Slide. Our next inspiration in this area is also from Alan Pearson with the Joanna Briggs Institute, and he was looking more at how can we look at other kinds of evidence apart from just randomized control trials, and how can we also look at the context from which we want to use that evidence. So he said evidence-based practice is not exclusively about effectiveness. It is about basing practice on the best available evidence. The diverse origins of problems in healthcare require the utilization of diverse range of research methodologies to operate or to generate appropriate evidence. And this is what inspired us to use what we will see in the slides that my colleagues will present, called the FAME, which stands for feasibility. How feasible is the intervention? How appropriate is the intervention? How meaningful is that intervention? And how effective is that intervention to that particular context? Slide, please. Then the knowledge brokering era is the area where we are focused on at the moment with the project that we did. We developed a toolkit known as the eBASE Family Toolkit, which helps to get evidence into households using the systems, existing healthcare system structures. And more of this we will see in the presentation that will be brought forth by 9. Slide, please. This approach is actually promising for big data because we use community health workers to go into households and collect both qualitative and quantitative data, which brings out disability, kids with disabilities or people with disability that are living in households, known or unknown, and also to further dig into what are the rights and the needs of children with disability within those households, and how can we map this to existing evidence. Slide, please. So it's a complex process that we do with community health workers. So community health workers pick up data, both qualitative and quantitative data, and they send this to us using WhatsApp. And then we use another software called MaxQDA to transcribe the qualitative data and MAPI to analyze the quantitative data. And with this, we are able to have materials that we can use for decision making. Slide, please. And this concept of using geomaps and data, household data for decision making is actually not new. It's a concept that was inspired by what the king, a 17th century king in Cameroon was thinking about. So on the left-hand side, you see a map of his kingdom. And his maps was not to tell him where to go about in his kingdom, but his map was particularly to let him know what are the problems within each household in his kingdom, because he realized that that could help him to make better decisions. And when the Germans came into Cameroon around 1882, they felt that this was a huge threat to their colonial power. So all the maps that the Sultan had developed were seized, and they are currently in a museum in Germany. Slide, please. So for us to understand the evidence architecture, we use the JBI model for evidence-based healthcare, but we can use this across all other basic services: education, environment, agriculture, energy, and finance. So it's just a wheel that goes from global basic services to evidence generation in basic services, to evidence synthesis in basic services, to evidence transfer in basic services, and evidence implementation in basic services. Slide, please. So what we do is, by looking at the whole evidence ecosystem, we can identify evidence questions or evidence issues within the wheel that we saw earlier on. And we can know if there is already existing evidence, so we don't need to reinvent the wheel, but we learn from the existing materials. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for your presentation. So I think we'll go to the next speaker. We'll keep the questions for the Q&A session. So people must use the chat to ask their questions as speaker present, so that it makes things easier at the end. We'll pull all the questions to all the speakers in the Q&A session. So we'll go over to the next speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Nainu, and I'm very happy to join in this session to talk with you guys. I'm going to be presenting on the eBASE Family-Centered Evidence Toolkit for Disability, Rights and Needs, which we developed here at eBASE to improve on the livelihoods of people with disability. This toolkit brings research evidence into households and communities of people with disability who may be left behind the evidence stream. This project was funded by the Waka Foundation and SSBK, Poland. So throughout the presentation, we are going to see how we develop this toolkit and how it is impacting on the livelihoods of people with disability. The objective of this project is we sought to improve livelihoods of people with disability using innovation and best practices. According to WHO, the global burden of disability is at 15%, and 23% are in low and middle income countries. In Cameroon, we have like 80% of this 15% burden is in low and middle income countries, and 23% of this is lower down to Cameroon, where we have a greater or a large burden. Even in the Northwest region, if we look down, it is about 6 to 10% of people having a disability in the Northwest region of Cameroon. Programs have often been developed for people with disability, living out their voice, and these programs have often been reported using quantitative data, living out their stories and their experiences. This is inclusive of the evidence stream, which is leaving them behind. Slide, please. Slide. So how did we go about developing this toolkit? We started by conducting a formative study that gathered experiences of children with disability to inform the design of this intervention. This we carried out through key informant interviews and focus group discussions. Slide. We went further to map out the geolocation of children with disability around Bamenda using Google Maps and MAPA from using a data collection tool which we adapted from the Washington group. So if you look at this map here, it has several colors. We have yellow, green, red, and blue. So this map zooms in on the mental health of children with disability around Bamenda. This map is from MAPA, how we mapped out the children with disability. And this tells how often a child with disability experiences depression on a daily basis, or on a weekly, or monthly, or how often in a year. Slide, please. And then we had stakeholder engagement session where we discussed with families of children with disability to get their experiences around the houses and the communities where they come from. And we also gathered their experiences that help to inform the design of the intervention and to prioritize outcomes of interest in this project. Slide. After conducting these stakeholder sessions and key informant interviews, we went further to carry out an evidence search where we developed a PICO question to conduct a systematic search for best available evidence of what works for children with disability. We searched databases including Cochrane, Campbell, JDI, Africa Evidence Network, and we also searched databases of development agencies and government. We also email authors and organizations working in disability to get best available evidence to develop this toolkit. We found over 2,000 plus studies, out of which 150 of them were eligible. And in these eligible studies, we had 6 guidelines, 5 of which were WHO guidelines and 1 local guideline. And we also have 1 national policy. If you see this diagram here, these are 2 very important studies that were very instrumental during the design of this toolkit. Here we have the local guide and best practice guidelines from developed by Lean and others, and we also have the UN Convention for Rights of Persons with Disability. Slide, please. So after getting the research evidence and synthesizing, we now mapped it, or we modeled it into a toolkit through a defined process, as we see on this diagram here, where we have axis, because this toolkit is built on the 5 WHO community-based rehabilitation, including health, education, empowerment, livelihood, and social well-being. So what we did is that we took the current practices and we mapped it to evidence-based practices, as we see on this diagram here, and we also mapped it to how it is contributing to SDG. So basically, this diagram shows, for example, medical needs for children with disability. We have the current practice that says that they don't have medical needs when they go to health facilities. They need assistive devices, they need physiotherapy, they lack insurance. So the evidence-based practice says children with disability should be given good medical, nutrition, and human contact. Children with disability need assistive devices to be provided to them to be able to access services that they need. Children with disability need health insurance. And how is it contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals? The Sustainable Development Goals says that by 2030, we should achieve universal health coverage, including financial risk protection, access to quality essential healthcare services, and access self-effective quality and affordable essential medicine and vaccines for all. And we see the research evidence to this extreme, your extreme right hand. Slide, please. So this diagram here shows how we modeled the toolkit. It's a briefing of how we went about this process, from qualitative evidence informed by meta-aggregation, that is experiences of people, to current practices informed by key informant interviews and focus group discussions, and also qualitative evidence, to modeling the toolkit, the family-centered toolkit, which is also informed by research evidence from evidence synthesis, and to best practices and evidence-informed actions at family and community. Slide, please. This is a snapshot of the eBASE Family-Centered Evidence Toolkit. So this toolkit has been developed and embedded into the smartphones of community health workers that they use during their household visits to explore aspects of disability. So the community health workers go around household to household and they ask the families sets of questions and they give them evidence-based recommendations so that they engage with their children with disability to elicit their rights and meet needs. So this is just a snapshot of how it looks like in their phone. Now we have a sample of questions here. For example, the community health worker can ask, does your child with disability have a disability card? If they say no, the score is 0. If they have applied for a disability card and they're still waiting for, they have a 1. And if they have it, they score a 5. So at the end of the day, this data is being uploaded to MagPie and we export it to Excel and do the analysis. Slide, please. So here we see a picture of how the toolkit looks like in MagPie with the scores there. Slide, please. Okay, after developing this toolkit all together, we then gathered community health workers and trained them. This is a picture showing community health workers who are attending a training of how to use this toolkit. So they were trained on how to collect data on the smartphone using this toolkit. So they go from household to household. After every 2 months, they visit the household of children with disability and they audit them on their current practices and give them evidence-based recommendations. And at the end of the day, families that meet 60% compliance to evidence-based recommendation are rewarded an income-generating seed fund to start up an income-generating activity that can generate income for them to support the needs of the household and the needs of the child with disability. Slide, please. This is a picture of income-generating activity. Slide, please. So here we see a young adult who was involved in this project and benefited an income-generating activity. She's actually doing poultry farming around their kitchen, and she's very proud of her business because it's going to provide her with some money to cater for her needs. Her parents are also proud of her. So they have been visited by community health workers for a period of time, and they have been audited, giving evidence-based recommendation, and they complied to above 60% score. And that is why she was then rewarded this income-generating seed fund, which she's happily doing here. Slide, please. Now we move to the results of the project. We developed 340 quotes to describe the experiences of people with disability in the communities, 29 categories, 90 subcategories, 340 code segments. We identified 12 current practices, 47 barriers, 12 facilitators, 16 coping strategies, and mapping of how conflict affects access for children with disability. Our barriers category revealed 5 subcategories and 16 coded segments, and we aligned them to the 5 community-based rehabilitation axes and developed guidelines for families for children with disability. This map here is extracted from Max QDA, where we coded the data from key informant interviews and focus group discussion. It's showing a single case model of current practices of a household of children living with disability. Slide, please. This is another picture that shows barriers to accessing basic services for children with disability. It shows how barriers impact on protection, financial access, educational needs, medical needs, and entertainment needs for children with disability. Slide, please. And these are results from data analysis. We see health insurance for children with the health situation for children with disability. So looking at the map here, we see that there has been like 0.41% change in the health category for children with disability. This category comprises of variables like discussing health issues with a child with disability, ownership of a disability card, health insurance, bonding with a child with disability, vaccination, actively protecting the child against FGBV, respecting hospital appointments for the child, and the child has the needed assistive devices. And for the educational variable, we see or we realize that there has been a 22.2% weighted average change for the variables comprising of child with disability attending school, family assisting the child with disability with homework, child with disability having all their school requirements, parents discussing the child's experiences in school, knowledge of what the child wants to read in future, and the child with disability having access to technology for learning. So after evaluating all these variables, we see that there has been a great change after the 2 months visit by the community health workers. Slide, please. The next slide we see here is a graphic of livelihood situation for the children with disability. There has been a 21.1% weighted average change for livelihood category, which comprise of source of income, property and material inheritance for children with disability, securing bank accounts for children with disability, securing legal documents to protect child with disability, knowing child's aspiration, protecting child with disability. During conflict, there has been a great improvement for what people are or parents are doing to protect their children with disability during conflict. This graphic to the right, we see the social situation of children with disability, and there has also been a great improvement of about 10.0 weighted average change for the variables, including assisting the child in community interaction, talking to the child about relationships, telling stories with child with disability, allowing the child to make some household decisions, knowing the favorite things of the child with disability, also knowing the favorite actor or musician of the child with disability, and the child with disability having access to entertainment, for access to technology for entertainment. Slide, please. And here we have the empowerment variable, and there has been 21.7% weighted average change in this variable that comprise of participation in community health, participation in community education, joining a Jangi group to support the child with disability, or joining a support group to support the child with disability. Slide, please. Here we have a picture of a disability card and a brief graphic. This is one of the results which we are very happy with, being able to help children with disability to get a disability card. Research evidence suggests that when a child with disability have a disability card, they are able to access basic services. In Cameroon, for example, the national policy states that children with disability will benefit free basic services, but these services are still not free if the children with disability do not have a disability card. So we are very happy to have contributed in helping children with disability have a disability card. And this diagram here shows that if a child with disability have a disability card, they are able to access basic services, and if they engage in evidence-based practices, it will improve their rights and their needs, or in all improving the livelihoods of the children with disability. Slide, please. The use of computer-assisted data collection and the eBASE family toolkit for data analysis and further use to develop a family-centered approach to improve lives of children with disability in low and middle-income countries has not been reported in research literature to the best of our knowledge. Using Max QDA enabled a more interactive and faster approach to understanding the rights and needs of children with disability in Cameroon, and subsequently facilitated the integration of best practices in the process. Slide, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nan, for your presentation. I hope the participants are still using the chat box to ask their questions so that we can make sure that we engage with you during the Q&A session. I would like to go to the next presenter, who is Alvin, to share his inputs as well. Alvin, over to you.
Sorry about that. I was waiting for you to unmute my mic. So good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining this event. I am Alvin Lontum. I am going to be presenting on the left behind topic, the economics of disability in Cameroon. And we will also be discussing how we can use evidence to create market channels for people with disability. Next slide. Economic security cover their essential needs sustainably and Next. Next slide, please. These needs are the ability to feed well, the ability to pay hospital bills, the ability to afford for education, and support children in vocational training. Next slide, please. Considering the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the UNDP, Leave No One Behind, and the AU's Africa We Want, economic security targets primarily the first 4 goals of Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide. Economic security, Sustainable Development Goals, and what works. From Sustainable Development Goals to using evidence within evidence portals to broker knowledge to households with persons with disabilities, eBASE hopes to improve livelihoods for people with disability. Next slide. From the community-based rehabilitation metrics, we can establish that most of the variables that we are concerned with for economic security are coming from livelihood. Next slide. And we can as well establish a link between economic security and community-based rehabilitation metrics. Next slide. Now, the objective of this project is improving livelihoods of persons with disability through the use of research evidence and economic empowerment through an income-generating activity or income-generating activities. Next slide. Now, this figure shows the setting where our study is taking place. This is Bamenda, the regional capital of the northwest region of Cameroon. And this is the geolocation of families with children with disabilities. And we had this map thanks to the MapPy software. Next. In our methods, we used stakeholder engagement sessions, rapid reviews, developing audit and feedback criteria that was using the same concept, system integration using community health workers and the parent-teachers associations, scoring and incentivizing households. Next slide. So we had these variables to be of interest for us. And if you go to the chat box, you would see the meaning of one of the variables explained there, the meaning of Njangi. So we have 7 of these variables. The first is possessing a disability card, adhering to health insurance, ownership of a source of income, adherence to inheritance, ownership of bank accounts, possession of legal documents, and joining a Njangi group. Next slide. Now, this figure paints the picture of the economic variables from the MapPy software. This is before our intervention, and we can see that health insurance, inheritance, and legal documents scored the lowest. That is just to tell you how sad the situation of people or children with disability is. Next slide. Now, after our intervention, we have had marked progress, especially for the source of income. We can see that for disability card, we have had a 6.7 percentage point increase. We have also had a 3.3 percentage point drop in health insurance. We've had a 33.3 percentage points increase in source of income. We've had 10 percentage point increase for bank account and inheritance. We've also had 20 percentage point increase in acquiring legal documents, and we've had 26.7 increase in joining in Yaounde group. Next slide. Now, let us look at poverty and disability. I'd also like to know your thoughts about this. If there exists a vicious cycle between poverty and disability, because according to WHO, there is a strong correlation between disability and poverty. Next slide, please. Now, from this figure, we can see that the source of income is cardinal to acquiring economic security or achieving economic security, because it is with a source of income that you can get legal documents from which you can access basic services. Next slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alvin, for your presentation. And I hope the participants are using the chat to ask questions, to give inputs, so that he can be able to have an opportunity to chat with you during the Q&A session. I would like to move on to our last speaker so that we can get to the next session of Q&A session. Over to you, Okwen.
Okay, thank you very much, Siziwe. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Awe Ani Akofo, and I'm very happy to be talking in this webinar. I'm going to be giving a talk on
Where your mic is still on?
Evidence and Disability Africa we want. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so though I'm going to be talking about this, I would like to ask participants, that is, if they can, to go to the comment section and write a sentence or two based on information gathered from previous speakers on how this project can actually contribute to the Africa we want. Next slide, please. So the Africa we want aspirations actually align with our disability projects. And here we have outlined 7 of them. And I'm going to be talking about them one after the other. The first one is a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development. So we realize that the project seeks to eradicate poverty, especially for people living with disabilities. And if rolled out at scale, it will significantly promote inclusive growth and sustainable development. Then the second one we have here is an integrated continent. And we realize that our plans to extend this to other Middle African countries will contribute to an integrated continent. And the third is an Africa of good governance and respect of human rights. So including people living with disabilities in decentralized governance like health management committees and parent teachers associations could promote good governance, thereby securing and protecting their rights, since we are going to be including them in all of these things. And the fourth is a peaceful and secure Africa. So we know that conflict and wars impact the worst on persons living with disabilities, as most of them, due to their disability, cannot run away or protect themselves during an armed conflict. So a project like this will go a long way to protect them from these harsh realities. And the fifth is an Africa with a strong cultural identity, shared values and ethics. So from our interactions with persons in Africa, we have realized that some practices in Africa still break the fabric of our strong cultural identity, like superstitious beliefs about persons living with disabilities. They believe that they are witches and wizards and they should not exist. So this project seeks to sensitize communities and mitigate stigma. Then the sixth one is an Africa whose development is people-driven. The project is driven by African people, and it is led by a young, dynamic, and enthusiastic lady, Nine. And we realize that this kind of people-driven projects could greatly contribute to improving livelihoods. And the last aspiration I have here is Africa as a strong, united, and influential global partner. So this project can compete at global stage as an evidence brokering platform or portal that can be used anywhere in the world, making Africa a global player. So returns on investment is actually the ratio between the profit and cost of investment. That is, we see if the cash invested really had any impact. And from this, we realized that the project had a very high return on investment, as we were able to directly impact 30 households with persons with disability and indirectly affect over 100,000 children with disability through policy influences. And this project was funded by Stichting Wakker Foundation Holland and SSBK Holland with a 20,000 euros grant, both in cash and kind. And in the pictures there, we see Groening and her sister, we see Gerdy and Dini also. And Gerdy and her husband, Vin, they have a backyard farm where they grow honeybees. They sell the honey and they use the proceeds in the project. So this is just one of the ways that they raise funds. There are other ways through which they raise funds. Then at the end of it all, we established a toolkit to get research evidence into households using existing structures. Next slide, please. So for our plans, we'll need to engage stakeholders to get the right questions and prioritize outcomes of interest. Then we'll also need to do research protocol designs. Then we'll need to compete for grants, but this is a little bit tricky because most often than not the best ideas get grants, but the best communicated. And we realize that in Africa, we really don't have the resources to pay someone to sit down and write a grant. Meanwhile, in the Western world, the story is different because they have the resources to actually dedicate someone for this. And the person can take up to a year to do a good job and come out with the best. So this goes a long way to give us an uneven playground, which is a little bit unfair. Then we also need to seek global partners to increase our chances by engaging with the partners in the North and the South. Then what we also plan to do for the future is to scale out. And by scaling out, we can either engage policymakers in Middle Africa or engage the African Union. And at the moment, we have not been able to penetrate the African Union, but we'll be happy to discuss this with some people who are watching this webinar who can give us some ideas or tips. And then again, people who can actually help us on any of these points that I've raised above can drop comments in the comment section, and we'll see how to engage from here. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yaounde, for your presentation. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the speakers for sharing their approach, their toolkit, and the lessons that they've learned as they were implementing the project. So I think the next part of this webinar, I think we have a little bit of time to go through questions that we've received from the chat so that we can give the speakers a chance to respond to those questions. And if we have finished those questions in the chat, we'll also get questions from the participants, but I'll hand over to Patrick for the question and answer discussion session. Over to you, Patrick.
Okay, thank you very much, Siziwe, and thanks to all the speakers for the great presentations. We have picked up some questions from a total of about 8 questions and some contributions in the chat box. First, starting with the contributions from Dr. Mina El Khali, who is from Morocco and who has expressed interest to connect with us. She's actually Executive Director in charge of Foreign Relations at the Arabic Media's Center for Advocacy for People with Disability. That would be a good connection for us to explore. So we will keep your contact and we will get in touch with you. We also have a question from one person from the participants, which is how was the project funded? And I think Mirabel already gave a response to that. But just to follow up on that, this project was funded on a small grant, as we heard in our presentation, about 20,000 euros from both cash and kind, by a group of family that actually just grow honey in their backyard in Holland and use the proceeds to promote access to basic services for people with disabilities. We also had a question that says, are there any Continental initiatives for protecting and promoting the rights of children with disability? So in this slide, the UN Convention for Rights of People with Disability has actually been validated by many African countries, and they have developed policies within these countries to help people with disability to respect their rights and also attend to their needs. But the challenge is in the implementation. A good number of these have been informed by evidence, but the implementation is a problem. For example, the case that Nain mentioned about the disability card. So to promote the rights of children and to protect their needs, certain basic services have been made free, like healthcare, education. However, for them to access those basic services, they need a disability card. And from our evaluation, from our initial assessment, only 20% of the kids in the Northwest, in the area that we're working with, actually had this disability card, meaning only 20% of them could actually access this free service. So the first thing we had to look at doing was actually increasing the number of children who have the disability card. And possession of a disability card is an evidence-based approach that has been reported in several studies, both in kids with disabilities and kids without disabilities. Having an identification document really will help you to access basic services and for your rights to be respected. Then the other question is, how did the project engage policymakers? I think Nain has also mentioned given some responses there. We work closely with the Ministry of Social Affairs, both at the decentralized level and also with the Ministry of Health at decentralized level. So engaging the policymakers, ensuring that people with disabilities or their family members are actually joining community boards, health management committees at public hospitals, or school boards in schools is the approach that we have really pushed forward from some of the results that Nain presented. Then the other question was from one of the participants. It says it's in French. Say they would like to know if this toolkit is also available in French. Unfortunately, at this time, the funding will not allow us to translate this to French, but this is something which is a very important topic and a very good question. And we would really want to translate this to French, especially as we are looking at scaling out or transferring this approach to other sites where eBASE is currently working. This is like Chad, Niger, Nigeria. So having this in French will be very important. And if I could just take that in French. Donc, merci beaucoup pour la question. Et il faut que je dise que c'est une question très pertinente. Et on est en train de voir comment on peut faire, si on peut avoir l'argent, pour avoir un bailleur qui peut nous donner de l'argent pour essayer de faire le scale-out de Toolkit dans les pays francophones. Donc, c'est quelque chose qu'on en pense et c'est quelque chose qu'on croit que c'est très, très important. Then another question was, okay, it's still in that question, it was asking if we would expand beyond Anglophone community. So another question was, what explains the drop in the health, what can explain the drop in the health insurance? So in essence, what happened is that we didn't have a change in the number of adherents to health insurance, because this is actually a very complicated variable, even for us to go around with. But in the first round of the study, on the baseline, when we're collecting the baseline data, one of the participants that was recruited did not report whether they had or did not have health insurance. But now, by the second round, when we came back, this was actually reported, and this has not been adjusted yet in the data sets. And then the final question was, which was also a question from one of our French participants, was about the zones that are covered by the project. For the moment, this project is only running in the northwest region of Cameroon, which is a conflict-affected area. But it's our hope that based on the way that the project is designed, we use existing structures, meaning that the implementation of the evidence-based approach is being done by community health workers during their routine household visits, meaning that it's easy for us to go beyond our area of work. If we need to go to another area within Cameroon, all we will need to do is to activate this at the level of the ministry. And then all that will be needed is just to train the community health workers so that during their regular household visits, they include evidence-based recommendations for people with disability. And this can be covered. Donc, en fait, ce que je disais en anglais pour la question sur laquelle Rhoda avait demandé qu'elle aimerait également savoir si les zones couvertes lors de ce travail sur le terrain. Et bon, j'ai expliqué que ce qu'on est en train de faire, c'est seulement dans le nord-ouest. Mais on va essayer d'aller dans les autres zones s'il y a les moyens. Donc, c'est plus facile d'aller dans les autres zones parce que on a déjà un produit qui est développé et tout ce qu'on a besoin pour le moment, c'est pour former les relais communautaires pour qu'ils peuvent aller jusqu'à dans les autres régions du Cameroun. So those were the questions I gathered so far, but I think some more questions have come up. There's a question from Beryl, which says, excellent presentations about thank you. And the questions are, did your engagement with community members continue after the formative studies? How? And are you engaging with people with disability directly on an ongoing basis? So as a response to your first question, Beryl, yes, our engagement with community members continued after the formative study. We took back the results from the formative study to the people, to the community, to the stakeholders, and we also developed the PICO together with them. So we had the formative study, then we developed the PICO thereafter, and in particular, the stakeholders had to tell us what were the outcomes of interest to them. What would it be? What would happen for them to say that they are happy with this evidence-based implementation project? So, for example, a good number of them said, yes, if income generating activity has been shown to be an effective approach of empowering people with disability, and certain models developed therein will help open channels for them to have access to markets. And this was their most pressing outcome. So we focused on this outcome as we walked through the project. And as we are going to the end of the project, as the community health workers collect data every month or every 2 months, we take back the results from this every 2 months, including qualitative and quantitative data, to the stakeholders and the household members, and we feed back to them. Then we also plan to do this on an ongoing basis. The funding will probably continue till the funding is continuing till the end of the year, but our hope is that we can convince donors to fund a scale out, or we can also convince governments to become engaged and invest in training community health workers to roll this nationwide. Another question from Beryl says, have you continued to engage with policymakers using the research findings? If yes, what are your policy influence objectives? So with the first set of findings, at the level of the formative study, we engaged with policymakers. At national level, we actually influenced the way data was reported at our hospitals. And this has been incorporated into the National District Health Information Software, which is used in Cameroon. So data sets for disability is now regularly collected. This was actually a finding that we had from the first stakeholder engagement that we had, and we brought this up to the policymakers. Now, working further from these results that we have had, we would need to disseminate these results to a more wider audience and at national level. And the challenge we have there is that the original funding did not plan for this. So the challenge we have now is finding the funding to engage the policymakers. But what we are doing at the moment is talking to policymakers. We've actually had some discussions with members of the Senate to be able to present these findings at one of their hearings. However, we do not know how this will progress. And of course, we are very sure that it will incur some cost on our part, because we will need to travel to Yaounde, which is the capital, to make these presentations and to talk with policymakers to try to advocate for certain policies to be modified. Another question from Beryl is, can you clarify if community health workers are continuing to use the toolkit and providing data for ongoing reflection and learning themselves? So yes, our intention is that with the community health workers that we have trained, they will continue to discuss the results of whatever results they are collecting from the field at coordination meetings at district level. So this will at the moment only work in the district where we have actually trained the community health workers. So based on the way it has been developed, they will not be spending any extra costs to collect the data, for us to manage the data and give back this data that can help to help with decision making at district level. So for the district, this continues, but scaling out to other districts, we would also still need to think about how to engage policymakers and funders to have that done. Another question from Dr. Mina is, we need to adopt not only rights approach, but social approach. We need to adapt all services and access to all structures in society. This is also very correct, and we would probably talk with Dr. Mina further after this session about how we could improve and ensure that the social approaches are also included, not just the rights-based approach. Then to train families who have children with disability is very necessary. To train teachers in inclusive education is also very necessary. So that's also contribution that's coming from Dr. Mina. Then we also have a question from Ndavumta, which says, on peut poser, okay, he's asking if we can ask a question live. Probably he would want to be unmuted to ask the question. I'm not sure. Maybe Siziwe will let us know. But mais Daniel, c'est mieux si on pose les questions dans le chat box parce que comme ça on peut gérer toutes les questions ensemble. Okay. A question is also there. Is this process sponsored by eBASE or by the families? Okay, getting disability cards, and the question is it sponsored by eBASE or by the family? Okay, so eBASE does not sponsor the acquisition of the disability card, but one of the conditions for getting an income generating activity is having a disability card or meeting certain requirements. So that incentivization process encouraged the families to do the disability cards on one hand, but access or financial access to acquiring a disability card is a huge challenge, because some families with disabilities are so poor that for them to put together all the documents that they need to get the disability card is not possible. Unfortunately, many NGOs or many development agencies in Cameroon are actually promoting the possession of the birth certificate, because this is a civil right of all kids. And this birth certificate also includes for the children with disability. However, if a child with disability gets a birth certificate, that child cannot access basic services with the birth certificate. They are still going to need a disability card. So it's important for development agencies to also start thinking about the possibility of making government to support the financial challenges or to remove the financial barriers to possession of the disability card. She also asked if it is the families, what can be done to help families who can't afford? So at the moment, what can be done to assist families who can't afford is only to be able to get funding to support them, which at the moment eBASE does not have. There is also a question from Daniel. I think that Hunta finally asked the question in the chat box, and it says, dans les zones où beaucoup de personnes vivant avec un handicap moteur, comment seront formulés vos critères de sélection des bénéficiaires? So he's asking whether in areas where people have physical difficulties, or sorry, physical disabilities or motor disability, how do we use or how do we adapt the criteria for selections? So the way the toolkit is developed is in such a way that the first question is the kind of disability that the participant has. So once the kind of disability is identified, the questions are then filtered to that kind of disability. So a person with a visual disability will have a different set of questions from a person with a motor disability. Donc, c'est-à-dire que dès qu'on comprend le type d'handicap qu'une personne a, par exemple, si c'est un handicap moteur ou bien c'est quelqu'un qui est aveugle, ça sélecte, le logiciel va immédiatement décider ou bien prendre les questions qui sont pertinentes pour ce handicap. Donc, on n'aurait plus besoin à demander les autres questions ou bien, donc comme ça, une fois qu'on entre que c'est un handicap moteur, il y a les questions qui sont différentes de quelqu'un si c'est un handicap mental, par exemple. And another question or a comment from Ian Hopwood. Thank you for an interesting presentation that gives food for thought and inspiration for action. So this is from Senegal. Okay, so I think Siziwe, that probably covers all the questions in the chat box.
Okay, thank you very much, Patrick, for handling all the questions. I think that the issue of unmuting participants it's an issue of us managing time. We wanted to make sure that people ask their questions on time through the chat and be able to answer those questions. But because now we have run out of time, if people still have questions, they can still continue the conversation with the AEN at ace@uj.ac.za, and those questions can be posed to the speakers to ensure that all the participants can get all the answers that they require in terms of them learning from this particular webinar. So I think I'm really excited in terms of what we've learned today from the eBASE team Africa. So I'll take this time to just wrap up the webinar a bit at this moment. And I think to say thank you to all the speakers from eBASE Africa. Thank you very much for partnering with AEN on this particular webinar and enhancing the workstream 2 that is led by Charity. Thank you very much to all the participants. I saw the chat was very vibrant. We got a lot of questions. We got a lot of inputs. Thank you very much to you as well. Thank you to the AEN this webinar together. And most importantly, thank you very much to Workstream 2 Enhancing Capacities Working Group led by Ms. Charity Chisoro and her team, namely Wiseman Dlela, Frejas Toto, and Dio Hondolo, Enoch Musungwini, and Dee. Thank you very much for putting this webinar together, because you are the working group members that are working tirelessly behind the scene to ensure that we have such webinars and learn from them as we go to Evidence 2020. Please join us virtually for Evidence 2020. It's taking place on the 23rd to the 25th of September 2020. Please register online. It's free. Use that link. We're looking forward to you joining us, particularly on this work stream, to advance this discussion there and ensure that we learn from you and you learn from us. And lastly, if you want to be an AEN member, you can also join us. It's free to be an AEN member to be able to contribute and build this Pan-African community that really is contributing to the eradication of poverty and inequality. Thank you very much, everyone. We really appreciate your participation as we build up to Evidence 2020. And I would like to take this opportunity to adjourn this webinar. Thank you so much. The recording and the slides will be shared with everyone so that you can, have this on your side as well. Thank you so much. The webinar has been adjourned. Thank you, everyone.